Hello, everyone. This is Christina Osborne with ISO Stakeholder Affairs. I know some of you probably were on the ADS training that was right before this session. So thanks for your patience. We're just waiting for the trainer to join. This call is actually focused on training for the dispatch operating target tariff clarification. We did submit the slides for posting out on the Learning Center, which can be found under the Participate tab on ISO's website. I haven't seen the slides for the DOT training nor the ADS training yet, but they should be posted by end of day. So you can keep checking, and they should be available by end of today. We are also recording this session, and we'll make that recording available on that same page. So as soon as we receive the recording from AT&T, we'll make sure it's available along with the ADS training. So I do have Gina Wanzer. She is the Senior Client Trainer from Customer Readiness Group. She's going to be leading the training. So she'll go through the slides. We will be pausing throughout to take questions. And so you can either ask your question verbally, so press pound 2 to enter the queue, or if you feel more comfortable, you can send your question via chat to the panelists, and we'd be happy to read it out loud. So it's whatever you feel comfortable with. So with that, I'll just go ahead and turn it over to Gina.
Okay. Hello. For those of you who were on the previous ADS call, thanks for your patience with transferring over. And for those of you who are just listening in on the DOT tariff clarification piece of things, thanks for your patience as well. So thanks for joining us today. We're going to be talking a little bit about the DOT tariff clarification. Just to kind of set the stage a little bit. So after this training, you'll be able to identify some of the changes that are coming in ADS with this clarification project. I have just linked here the BRS for your reference, because those are the requirements that we'll be touching on when we go through the training today. We'll also be talking about, or you'll also be able to identify what information can be identified when an operating instruction is sent to ADS by the ISO operator, in particular as is referring to the EIR, or Eligible Intermittent Resources. And then we'll talk about upcoming dates for implementation. If you were in the ADS training, it's going to be very similar in terms of the timeline, because it is coming through the ADS replacement application. But for those of you who are not joining the part 2 earlier today, I wanted to make sure we touched on that. So to continue setting the stage, I'm just going to review a couple of the terms, because we're going to be talking about these quite a bit, or saying them quite a bit. So eligible intermittent resources, you just heard me say that. These are EIRs, which is a variable energy resource. Some of you will know these as in like particular solar or wind resources, but these are generating units or dynamic system resources, which are subject to a PGA, or a participating generator agreement, a net scheduled PGA, or a dynamic scheduling agreement for SPs, or maybe a pseudo-tie PGA. So these are EIRs in the CAISO BA that we'll be focused on today. The other term that I just want to touch on as well is the operating instruction, or operation instruction. Sorry, I meant to correct that earlier. But this is basically a command by operating personnel responsible for real-time operation of the interconnected BES, or bulk electric system, to change or preserve the state, status, output, or input of an element of the bulk electric system, a facility of that BES, or bulk electric system, or the facilities of a participating generator. An operating instruction will be communicated consistent with these practices that are associated with NERC Reliability Standard COM2-4. So, basically it's a command by operating personnel to preserve the state, status, output, or input. So we're preserving the bulk electric system. You might get an operating instruction to make moves to meet that. So we're going to talk about why that's a little bit more important here. So just to take a step back, and again, I want to make sure I set the stage here. So back in 2018, we went through some stakeholder initiatives or stakeholder process steps, and so which included comments, revisions, and FERC approval. This stakeholder initiative was called the DOT Tariff Clarification or Dispatch Operating Target Tariff Clarification. It was becoming something where eligible intermittent resources, or again what we said were EIRs, at times they could pose operational risks when we were in certain operating conditions. So sometimes these could be during overgen situations, or maybe there were transmission constraints that were showing up due to output of the EIRs. So this became a conversation in terms of terminology, process, as well as going through the process to update the tariff and some of the BPMs to clarify some of this, what I said, like the terminology and the process. In particular, we're going to talk about today managing your DOT or responding to the DOT. So that was in 2018, and actually one thing I just want to say here too, if you have questions about that process and how we came to today, you can go back and visit that stakeholder initiative. I provided the link here, or if you just go to the stakeholder process page, if you're familiar with that, and search, DOT or dispatch operating target, I think it'll come up there. You can visit that if you have questions as to how we got to where we are today and some of these tariff clarifications and BPM appendices. But we're not going to revisit that whole process today. Today we're going to do training on what changes are coming, in particular as it relates to the market and ADS, receiving those on the ADS side. So for the piece that's coming with Fall Release 2020, the operating instructions are currently given through verbal instruction, right? So if you're one of those folks or one of those teams who receives operating instructions from the generation dispatcher or generator operator, you may get a call that issues an operating instruction. It's currently a verbal instruction through a phone call, and this project includes changes to allow to receive that operating instruction for the EIR through ADS, as well as to incorporate changes to allow for EIRs to automate responses to those operational instructions, which may require a resource to not exceed their DOT or dispatch operating target. So if you want to review the BRS or the business requirements for that, here's a link for that again, okay? So again, today we'll be covering a slight review of some of the background information needed to understand what's coming, but we're not going to go into the stakeholder process from 2018. So just to touch on tariff, so I talked about how there were some tariff clarifications and BPM pieces. I'm just going to pull some pieces of the tariff to help support some of the changes that we're coming to today or understanding some of those changes. So from section 3413.1 in the tariff, notwithstanding requirements to comply with and respond to dispatch instructions, there's a whole list of requirements behind responding to dispatch instructions, but there is a scenario when an eligible intermittent resource or an EIR DOT is equal to the forecasted output, it may produce to its capability. So meaning generating to its capability, max capability. There are also EIRs who are in the process of developing their CAISO forecast, meaning they're opting into the CAISO forecast, and we are in the middle of developing that data. So those folks are also pursuant to this as well. So if an EIR market DOT equals the EIR forecast, this can result in the ability for the EIR to generate as capable. That is not all the time, though. So this piece is an indicator. But let's talk about another case. So I took a piece from the market operations BPM here, so section A.12.1, which is consistent with the piece of the tariff we just talked about, another whole section. The EIR must not exceed its DOT when the subcomponent of the dispatch instruction is negative. So the dispatch instruction has a subcomponent, which hopefully most folks who are here today are familiar with. When that subcomponent is negative, the EIR is expected to not exceed its DOT. So to, again, paint out the picture, if the EIR market DOT is less than the forecast, which results in a negative subcomponent of the dispatch instruction, then it's the EIR is expected to not exceed the DOT. So that's another concept to think about as we move into this conversation. So the next piece here is the CAISO may CAISO may issue an operating instruction directing an eligible intermittent resource of the EIR not to exceed its DOT if necessary to maintain system reliability, right? So we talked about an operating instruction and what that means, and this is really in that vein of maintaining system reliability. And it's expected to be through the NERC standard communication, and they'll issue a written or verbal communication to the FCs where that is going to be in place. So what we're going to talk about today is this piece and how it's going to look in ADS. But to kind of continue the conversation of the concept, let's just use this as an example. So let's say the market calculations are showing congestion or overgeneration. So they're showing some transmission or system concerns. The EIRs might be effective to mitigate those concerns. It may be the only effective. And it may be a reduced output in order to be effective, and the market may dispatch DOTs, in which case some EIRs may result in a negative real-time SUP. So we talked about that negative real-time SUP value, where the DOT is less than the forecast. So here I might ask the question, so when would an EIR be able to generate as capable? And hopefully the answer in your question or in your mind is when the DOT, the market DOT, is equal to the forecast, right? So now we're showing an example of when the DOT is less than the forecast, they may end up with a negative SUP, and that's going to result in following or not exceeding their DOT. Okay, so another scenario is if we're experiencing system issues, the CAISO generation desk may issue an operating instruction. So the operator may issue the instruction or operating instruction, or what some people know as OI, and that would be to not exceed the DOT. And then the operating instruction would require them to communicate per the NERC standards, NERC COM standards. And then those resources must not exceed the DOT until the operating instruction is changed. So these operating instructions have NERC compliance implications. And if I were to go back, if I were to go back here, failure to operating instruction is a violation of the CAISO rules of conduct as well. So just keep that in mind there. And again, I'm not trying to rehash this, I'm just trying to review some of the concepts related to this. So with the DOT tariff clarification project, there's 2 new flags introduced in the new ADS replacement. There's the operating instruction flag, which is indicating an operating instruction is in place. And then there's a follow DOT flag, indicating a scenario where the EIR is not to exceed their DOT. This follow DOT flag can flag in 2 different scenarios. So first is it could flag for market optimization when that resource DOT is less than the forecast. So think when you were looking at that negative SEP, or you had to go and look at your SEP column and see if it was negative to see that, now there's a flag. Or the follow DOT flags can flag when there's an operating instruction in place. So if an operating instruction is in place, it will also flag the follow DOT flag. So we're going to go more into that here. So I'm just going to keep reiterating some of the concepts. You might feel like this is a little repetitive, but I'm just going to keep reiterating some of the concepts so that when we tie it to the flags, it's a little more clear. So under challenging local or system conditions, additional needed control can trigger an operating instruction by the ISO operator, right? We talked about in certain system conditions, their goal is to maintain reliability, and so they may need to issue an operating instruction, in which case that would mean a yes here and equals do not exceed DOT. So here, I'm going to expect some of those flags that I just talked about to flag, right? So if I go back and I look here, an operating instruction is in place, so I would expect this flag to say yes. And the follow DOT flag says, yeah, I will flag when an operating instruction is in place. So in this scenario, we would expect both flags. Now, I don't know if I also mentioned this earlier, so just in case, I'm going to say it again because I said it in the ADS one. Feel free to ask questions in the chat as well. I'll take a pause here in a minute. Actually, maybe I'll just take a pause here to see if there's any questions just relating to the concepts themselves.
So again, if you want to ask your question verbally, press #2 to raise your hand. And Roy, let me know if anybody enters the queue, please.
All right, there's nobody in the queue at this time.
Great. Either everybody's fallen asleep by now or I'm just doing a really good job. So I'm going to go with the latter. So, okay, so let's talk a little bit about the operator side. So when the operator notices notices an issue, an operations issue, and they determine that it's appropriate to put an operating instruction in place, they will be doing so through the real-time market, and they will have a couple of things that they'll need to identify. One is which resources are under this operating instruction. This may be an individual EIR resource, which, that's kind of a qualification thing, and then you might be flagged as an EIR resource in our area. It could be a group of EIRs, and this is typically by the transmission access charge area, or maybe a group of EIRs at a trading hub. And then there's also the system-wide, all EIRs in the system, and when I say system, I mean CAISO BAA. So they'll have to choose the resources in which are impacting that system condition. Then they'll also have to enter a reason, which might be congestion, system reliability, or over-generation. And then they'll include a start and an end time. So today you might get a phone call that says, I'm issuing an operating instruction starting at 0900 through 1600 for X resource to not exceed their DOT. And so these are the types of things that you will see similar, right? So now instead of getting that verbally, you'll be starting to get that in ADS. So here, this is what it's going to be like when it's received by ADS. There's a new instruction type called OP instruction. Then there's a message notification pop-up. So if you were in the ADS training just a little while ago, we talked about the batch type and how, you'll get your instruction through that new batch type. So for those of you who weren't in that, it'll be a new batch type, and it will be in the batch grid as its own column. And then within the configuration panel in ADS, you also have the ability to manage the message notifications within the UI itself. The message will remain until acknowledged. The acknowledgement, the first acknowledgement from the SC side is going to be recorded due to the fact that it is an operating instruction. We talked about, operating instructions need to adhere to the NERC COM 2 standard, and part of the NERC COM 2 requires acknowledgement, right? So that 3-part communication, but when it's web, you need to make sure you get an acknowledgement from at least, if it's a blast message, at least one, or, an acknowledgement from the entity which is receiving that operating instruction. Now, the acknowledgement is going to be recorded, and it will show that there was an acknowledgement in the UI. I apologize, I didn't get the screenshot here, but there will be a column there that will show that an SC has acknowledged it. When the user, so we talked about how there's a message notification that will pop up if the user acknowledges it, that's at the user level. So if you have SCA and SCB, SCA has the renewables desk and SCB is not. Let's say the renewables desk goes on break and SCB gets the operating instruction, then SCA comes back to their console. They should still see the message because they did not acknowledge it. However, they will see that there was an acknowledgement recorded if the SC covering for them acknowledged that instruction, okay? So the message pop-ups are at the user level, but just note that the acknowledgement itself and recording of that will be at the SC level, okay? Now, the operating instruction flag will also flag here. This will show as a Y in this column. And this is a screenshot from that resource data grid. So, the resource grid where you have all the columns when you select, and you can select which resource you want to view more data on. These are going to be the columns you'll see. So similarly, this should look pretty familiar. Besides flagging that there's an operation instruction in place, you'll see the reason. So we talked about how the operator is going to choose a reason, and then a start and end time. So we'll have the start and end time for the operating instruction, the reason, as well as a flag to say it's in place, and then the resource that will be in the row. So you'll click on the resource and see the data associated. So similarly, the API V8 will have a similar notification type. So it'll have basically these 4 fields as well, something with the flag, giving you the reason, and the start and end time, okay? So to kind of jump into a little bit of a mini example, I kind of went through one in a way, but more so related to the acknowledgments. But operator identifies an operational issue on resource A at 8:50 Pacific time, and they issue an operating instruction to the resource through 1900 Pacific time. So the SC for resource A sees the operating instruction in the ADS UI. The data populates, as we mentioned, to the 4 fields that we talked about, the start time, the end time, the reason, as well as flagging the flag. And then what we talked about a few slides ago is when we put an operation instruction in place, the follow DOT flag would also flag as yes. So this is what an operating instruction would look like in the UI. And sorry, I know it's a little blurry. I didn't get a chance to fix that. But you'll see here the start time of 0850, 1900 end time, and then the fields that were populated with that. Okay. Now this will be coming through the RTD payload, if you will, so it will come pretty quickly after the operator has entered it. And then when you click on the resource, you have that instruction grid below, which filters the data for that resource. And here I just gave a quick snapshot of what the operating instruction will show. So there'll be a instruction type. So, you know, you might have your startups, your shutdowns, and off instruction, and then you have the time frame as well. Okay, so before I move into the follow DOT flag, oh, and actually one more thing, sorry. I don't think I actually included this in all the right slides, but if it is there, it's definitely a thing. If you registered for the Market Sim participation, similarly to if you were in the ADS call, validating that you can view this data as part of a structured scenario. And then this data, again, is supported in the new ADS UI as well as the version 8 API. So the operating instruction piece is part of V8 as well as the new ADS UI. Okay, so but I'm going to stop here for questions. Let me go back to here.
So again, if you have a question, you can raise your hand by pressing #2.
All right, we have no questions at this time. Oh, I take that back. We did get one question that just came in.
Okay, and we have a chat question too.
All right,
thanks.
So we'll go ahead and go to the caller first. First caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yes, hi Gina. My name is Doug Levitt. I'm a wind power plant operator. And my question is, okay, now once we got this instruction, we got the notification, where do we go now to see what our DOT and forecast are?
So that will be viewed. Do you currently use ADS?
No,
okay.
I don't have ADS currently, but it's in my future, I'm sure.
I have a feeling it's in your future too. Unless your SC provides some sort of third-party software, perhaps, or maybe if your company does that. But to do that, you would view it in the ADS UI. If I go here, let me just jump over to this. There's a couple ways, but like there's this instruction grid which would show your DOT as well as in this resource grid. That being said, I know every entity is different and some folks use a third-party vendor tool to show some of this data. But the way would be to view it through ADS as well.
Okay, so the page that you are showing now has a function that you can select that'll give you take you to your DOTs.
Sorry, can you repeat that one more time?
Yeah, so the slide that you have up now on the screen, there is a button one can select to engage, and that will drop down all your DOTs for what, the whole time between the start date of the operating instruction and the end time?
Yeah, so what this grid here is what we call the resource data grid. When you select the resource itself here, and there are other columns that are options as well, which will show, for example, you know, your DOT and other parameters associated with your resource. But when you click on the resource itself, the bottom part of the display, which is called the instructions grid, that has the DOTs with your interval times, as well as any like startup shutdowns or the operating instruction in this case.
And is that for a 24-hour period, every 5 minutes for 24 hours, or?
I don't recall the total window of time. Maybe if I can ask one of my SMEs to help me out. And I actually don't know on the speaker line who I might have. So let's come back to that one. So you're asking how long would the instruction grid show the DOTs for?
Yes. As long as it shows it for at least the length of the operating instruction, that would be sufficient. But I'm just wanting to know.
So it may not show that, it's not going to show that far in advance. It's actually really, because DOTs are at 5-minute intervals. and that could change. That would be coming through the dispatch, like through that batch type, but you could turn on notifications for if there are changes, if you will. So if you get a resource which has a DOT associated with that in that batch type, you could turn that on.
So we'd get an alarm or a notice every 5 minutes for, in this case, over 12 hours. 12 hours.
I mean, it could change, right, theoretically, because based on the, depending on the issue and alleviating it. However, so that being said, I'm trying to think of the best way, because there's current ADS training just to learn a little more about how ADS works, but I can take a note here to follow up with in terms of, well, so let me actually talk a little bit about this. I think that's the purpose of the flag. So the reason that, part of the reason that the flag has been provided is to maybe provide a way to automate for your resource to follow the DOT, meaning adjusting your resource. I know not everybody has the capability to do that, but that might be something that may need to be looked at. What I would do is coordinate with your scheduling coordinator on this.
Okay, thank you.
Roy, do we have anybody else in the queue?
We do actually have another caller in the queue. Okay. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, Christina. This is Sandra Morris from SMUD. I have a question for you back on, well, I guess it's on slide 17. The next one. At the bottom there, it says if you registered for market sim participation. I wasn't aware that you needed to do that, and so I guess we have not. How do we go about doing that?
I believe the email, so I know it was due a couple weeks ago. Let me actually see. One thing is someone, well, you know what, I'll come back to that. So the email, I believe, is marketsim@kaiso.com, but what you can do is if you go to where the business requirements are, there's also like a market simulation structured scenarios document. In that, it talks about the market simulation itself, but there's also some contact information in there. I'm not sure if they're like what their procedure is for accepting late, registration, but I would email them and see if you can register. Because what they're going to have to do is they're going to have, no problem. But just to give an idea on the registration piece, part of it is because they're going to have to be able to generate an instruction. So.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you so much.
No problem.
All right, any other questions, Roy?
We do actually have another question in the queue. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, hi, this is Hoffman from PG&E. I might have missed this because I got a call, but I was curious if the alert for operating instructions is going to be continuous on ADS.
The alert for the instructions is going to be continuous, meaning if the instruction is applicable from 1000 to 1900, are you going to get an alarm every 5 minutes for those intervals? Is that your question?
Well, like you said, only one person has to acknowledge, if you send out a blast operating instruction. So my question is just, will the audible on ADS continue to alarm until it's actually addressed by the user?
So I think to answer your question, if there are other users logged in and it has been acknowledged by someone at your entity, like at your SC location or at your ST level, if it's already been acknowledged by one person, it will just show as acknowledged to us and to you. The pop-up and the audibles will continue to go for anybody who also has ADS up and has not okayed the pop-up.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes, totally. That's great. Thank you.
Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Roy, any other questions?
There are no further questions on the phone line at this time.
Okay, there's one or two in the chat. Did you see those, Gina? One from Isaac Singh.
I did, and
okay, go ahead.
Okay, so the first question in here, can acknowledgement be provided by the SC via API? I believe the question to that, the answer to that is yes, but I will have to double confirm it. The next thing here is, wouldn't an EIR resource be a negative step to follow DOT based on 3 scenarios, not 2? Operating instruction, market optimization due to congestion. Oh, I see. Okay. So, yeah, so let me clarify a little bit. The negative step is a result of the market optimization when the forecast is less than, when the DOT is less than the forecast. The operating instruction does not necessarily result in a negative step. So that's kind of the differentiation. So let me go back a few slides here. Sorry. So we'll have an operating instruction, and actually we're going to do a couple examples as well, but for example, you have an operating instruction flag that goes with an operating instruction, but that operating instruction may also happen even if there is not a negative step. So if there is a negative step, you would have the follow DOT flag, but you may not have the operating instruction flag. Does that make sense?
And that was a chat question, so let's see if there's a response.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm reading the next few comments.
Yeah, he said yes, thanks. So.
Okay, cool. And then let's see, the forecast is, I'm also getting a reminder that the forecast is still available through CMRI, so folks can still check on the forecast through CMRI if they're looking to see where those, those DOTs may go. Also, one clarification I should make on the instruction panel is that there's only about 12 rows, and actually it's going to be more past DOTs, but you'll only get the DOTs for the next 5 minutes. So for the folks who are resource owners, as I mentioned, I would get with your scheduling coordinator and figure out the best way to do that in terms of managing monitoring for your DOTs. And so that's where I would guide you to go from there. And this was, again, part of the stakeholder process a couple of years ago, so you might listen in or look at some of the stuff from that. And then, and the clarification on the number of instruction panel rows is 19 rows. But regardless, it really only shows you the next 5-minute dispatch, and that dispatch could change, that DOT could change. So, okay, so that being said, are there any other questions?
So, Roy, is there anybody else in the queue?
There's nobody else on the phone line queue at this time.
Okay, great. With that, I am going to
Gina,
David, sorry, too far.
Oops, sorry. David Aguilar did send a chat saying, to clarify, a negative step with a follow dot flag can be because of congestion or economic bids, correct?
Congestion or economic, right. It could be economically dispatched into if it's mitigating an issue. That's correct. Thank you. Okay, so here's kind of the dispatch instruction side. So, and this actually is perfect coming from David's question as well. So under normal system conditions where you're not issuing an operating instruction necessarily, but market dispatch is able to help control the supply-demand balance or an issue, like a transmission issue. So, excuse me. So there would be a dispatch instruction potentially for certified EIR or pending EIR. Remember, we talked about the certified EIR, you've already been qualified, but then there are certain EIR resources which are, that sounds redundant, by the way. There are certain resources which are EIRs, and they're still in the process of, getting their CAISO forecast and whatnot. And so they're actually scheduling their forecast. And so rather than forecast equaling DOT for them, it would be, DOT equaling their schedule. So for the certified folks who are already like 100% EIRs, if their DOT equals the forecast, then we're looking at them generating as capable. Similarly, for the pending EIRs, if their DOT equals their schedule, then they're also generating as capable. But then that other scenario where the market dispatch is, doing an optimization, and as David had mentioned, it could be based on congestion, or it could be based on economic market bids or over generation. You could see the DOT go less than the forecast in both cases. So, DOT less than forecast. And then for the pending EIR, the DOT being less than the schedule. And in those cases, the result would be not exceed your DOT. So kind of reiterating that piece of it. And in this case, that relates to the follow DOT flag. So we got a question about kind of leading into this, right? And it is possible for you to have a follow DOT flag in this scenario, but an operating instruction has not yet been put in place. In either case, it's indicating do not exceed your DOT. In this case, it's beginning with the market dispatch or that negative step. And then I kind of lost my train of thought there. But in this case, we're indicating a negative step. So there is a hand raised. So if we want to go ahead and address that.
Thank you. So Roy, we'll take the question.
Okay. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Doug Levitt again. Gina, I think you may have just explained it just now, the answer to my question, but in slide 12, you show, I think, two scenarios. One is what to do under an operating instruction, and then a second scenario, what do you do in response to a dispatch instruction? Those are two separate, I'll call them events, or notifications from CAISO. Is that correct?
Correct. Or we're now giving you a flag for that, right? So for the dispatch instruction, previously you had the negative step column, or you had the supplemental column, and you would have to look for it to be negative in that scenario. And so now there's a flag to go with that. And then operating instruction is separate, but will result in that follow DOT flag as well.
Yes, but it's not an operating instruction you have to follow regardless of whether there's a negative sub or not.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Exactly. Thank you. Okay. So with that, I'm going to move into talking a little more about the follow DOT flag. You may have previously heard of this flag as the EIR flag. I think that's what it was listed as in the BRS a while back, but it was changed to follow DOT flag. So this, again, like I said, is set by the market optimization for when the resource DOT is less than the forecast for reasons such as congestion, over generation. And then the operating, there is It is also coming when the operating instruction is applied. So there's two scenarios where the follow DOT flags can be set by the market. One would be by these market optimization processes, but also when an operating instruction is applied in the market. So given that either of those cases was in place, it would send the, it would set the DOT flag and then send to ADS in the next RTD dispatch. The ADS receives the follow DOT flag, and there will be a column listed as follow DOT flag. This will be flagged as a Y if there is a flag in place. Otherwise, it will be blank. If for some reason the DOT is less than the forecast due to an outage put in, maybe there was some timing or something like that, you know, you would not see a negative step. You also would not get the flag. So the follow DOT flag, if for some reason the DOT became less than the forecast due to an outage that you put in, then we would not expect the follow DOT flag to be flagged. Okay, so let's do a couple examples here. I have Res A Solar. Their actual output is 17 megawatts. Their market DOT is 15 megawatts. Their forecast is 15 megawatts. And the current time is 0850 Pacific time. So Resource A Solar is generating as capable. The operator recognizes an operational system condition and issues an operating instruction for this Resource A or Res A Solar from 0850 to 1900 via the market UI due to reason congestion. So what would you expect the ADS UI to show in the next RTD dispatch? So I'll give you guys a minute to think about that. So hopefully your thought process here is, well, my DOT is meeting my forecast and I was generating as capable, but now I'm expecting to see an operating instruction in place. So I'm expecting the operating instruction, and I'm just going to go ahead and go to the answer. Oops. Okay, so now I'm going to expect that the operating instruction column is going to go to yes, because there was an operating instruction put in place. I'm going to expect that there was a reason of congestion put in the column and a start time of 0850 and an end time of 1900. So here's the 0850 and the 1900. And then I would also expect that follow DOT flag to flag as yes to show or due to the operating instruction that was in place. Okay, so there was no negative step here, but an operating instruction was put in place, and so therefore the follow DOT flag also flagged as yes. So example 2, now I have Resource B or Res B Solar. We should have picked on wind this time, huh? So we have Res B Solar. The actual output is 20 megawatts. The DOT is now 15 megawatts, and the forecast is 20 megawatts. And it's 0950 Pacific time. In this case, the Resource B is generating as capable. As we can see, the actual output is greater than the DOT. But market has began to economically dispatch the DOT less than forecast due to congestion. So what would we expect to see in the ADS UI in the next RTD dispatch? And currently, what do you see in your current ADS in this scenario? So here we have the DOT is less than the forecast. And so the SEP column will turn into a negative SEP. So that's what you see today in ADS, and you will still see that in the new ADS. But now we also expect, oh, my slide will move, sorry. Oh, too fast, sorry about that. Okay, so now we will expect that the new ADS would show a blank for all the operating instruction columns, right? Because there's no operating instruction in place yet. We haven't talked anything about that. but we will expect that the follow DOT flag is a Y because of that negative step. So the fact that the resource DOT is less than the forecast. Okay, so here DOT is less than forecast. No operational instruction has been put in place yet. So it is possible that you have this follow DOT flagged to follow that dispatch instruction, but the other columns are blank because there's no operating instruction in place. Okay, so we have one last example here, and I'm coming up on the last minute here. So RESP solar is generating as capable. Forecast and market DOT are equal at 15 megawatts. No operational issues are identified. No operation instruction issued. So here, what do we expect to see? And hopefully everybody's thinking you won't see anything for these particular columns because there's no operating instruction in place. There's no negative step, and the resource can generate as capable. So hopefully that's the answer that everybody was saying in their head. Okay, so let's talk really quick on timing for the folks who weren't able to make it to the ADS replacement. Actually, yeah, I'll talk really quickly and I can answer some questions if people are hanging on. The ADS replacement phases, so we do have Market Sim coming up on July 27th through September 4th. The map stage environment will remain available until November 4th. So for those of you who are still doing some testing there, even though the structured scenarios are done, you maybe will still be able to do some testing through then. For parallel operations, that's going to be September 1 to September 30th, and that's going to be in the stage environment. It's going to be streaming production data, and so you'll be able to do some data validation there maybe. You'll be able to do some filtering checks to see if you can do the filter check, and then production go live is October 1st, and that'll be in the production environment with the old ADS being decommissioned on February 1st. So keep in mind that the new ADS is going to be the one with the operating instruction changes. So the current old ADS will not have those changes. Same thing with V6 will not contain those changes, but V8 will contain the changes with the operating instructions. The presentation for this can be found on, I see a chat question here. The presentation can be found on KISO.com. Actually, I'm going to skip through this really quick just to talk about it. So on KISO.com, oh, I didn't even put it on here. Sorry about that. So the KISO.com, and then participate into the Learning Center. I'll add that and see if we can get that into the posting as well. Oh, I guess you would need the presentation to get to that. So here's where I'm going with this. To get this presentation, KISO.com, participate, Learning Center. That's where you can find the presentation once we post it today. Is there a way to distinguish between congestion-induced follow DOT versus economic bid-induced one? I don't believe so. This is kind of like monitoring your subcomponent. So how you do it today, monitoring your subcomponent might be the way that you might do. If you can do it that way, then that's the way you would do it. I apologize, I'm not remembering off the top of my head. The other thing to keep in mind is the follow DOT flag could be in place for an operating instruction, and there would be a reason with that. But that's probably the best answer I have for you right now. And then will ADS continue to give us a visual curve regarding DOT instructions? Some of us are more visual, so we prefer graphs instead of tables. And yes, so if for those of you who don't have a lot of experience or maybe haven't sat in on the ADS trainings yet, if you go back to the ADS replacement training part 1, you'll see what that piece looks like. You'll just, you'll get a screenshot of what the UI is going to look like, which included the trajectory plot, if I think that's what you're referring to. The other piece you might be able to do is if you have a way to maybe query and turn that into a chart after the fact. That might be the other way. But I think what you're referring to is the trajectory plot, and that will also, that trajectory plot will be in the UI. Great. Okay, are there any other questions? Maybe I think I got through all the chat questions, but are there any questions on the phone line?
So again, if you have a question, you can raise your hand by pressing #2. Roy, do we have anybody in the queue at the moment?
There are no questions in the queue at this time.
Okay, and I do have one other answer. There was a question asking about acknowledging the operating instruction via the API, and it is able to be done via the API. There's a validate dispatch batch operation. I recommend you go to developer.kyso.com and take a look at the files associated with the new ADS version 8, because you will need version 8 if you're going to use the operating instruction piece of it. Okay, so I think with that, thank you so much, everybody, for your patience. Sorry for the late start, and we'll work to get these posted by the end of the day. So we again appreciate your patience with all of this. I hope everybody has a great day.
Thank you. Thanks, Roy.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using Event Services. You may now disconnect.